My name is Zhanna Nemtsova. I am the co-founder of the Boris Foundation, and I'm going to moderate the second panel dedicated to sanctions that Western countries imposed on Russia. So I think that in order to save our time, I will not present our speakers. You can see them on the wall. Michael McFaul, Dmitry Navosha, Yanis Kluge, Alexander Prokopenko, and Karl-Heinz Paquet. And thank you very much for joining me today. Well, I want this discussion to be more interactive. That's why I will ask probably a couple of framing questions to the whole panel and then follow up with individual questions. And I would be happy to take the questions from the audience. And I encourage you to use our great application Line Upper, and you can send your questions to the application. So, my first question. One more note. So I'm going to moderate it in English, but Dmitry Navosha will speak in Russian. And if you feel comfortable asking questions in Russian, you can do that. We have translation, so it's not going to be a problem. So I'm sorry. By the way, I see Julius coming. It's very difficult to moderate after Julius' great moderation, but I will do my best. My first question to the panel is, what are the key challenges that make sanctions less effective than many experts expected them to be? So we'll start with Mike.
With me?
With you.
Oh, okay.
So we're starting with Mike because I will explain it to you, because he co-leads the McFaul group on international sanctions.
Okay, well, first of all, I want to say a couple of things about your father before I talk about sanctions, because I didn't fly all the way from California just to talk about sanctions. I came here to honor Boris Nemtsov. He was a friend of mine. He was an incredible, charismatic, funny, smart person. I've had the honor and privilege of interacting with a lot of incredible politicians, with a lot of incredible fighters for human rights. My boss for 5 years was a guy named Barack Obama. And Boris ranks as one of the most inspirational political figures I've ever had the privilege of knowing. And you as a country, we as a global society are a lot worse off because we don't have Boris here with us today. Second, I want to say, Zhanna, we met right after your father was killed at the Munich Security Conference. I don't know if you remember.
I do. I interviewed you.
You did.
For Deutsche Welle.
And Boris, I've known him since the 90s. I've known him for a long time, way before I was in the government. And he used to tell me about this incredible daughter that he had, who was even smarter and more charismatic and more beautiful than him.
Exaggeration.
And when I met you, it was like, oh my God, this is his spirit in you. And you said you were going to create this foundation back then. And I just want to congratulate you for what you've done. It is fantastic what you were doing. And then the third thing I want to say, and this is a message especially to my Russian friends who are in the room. Boris had a view, we all failed. Let's be clear. Boris Nemtsov and me and others, we failed in the vision that we'd hoped for, which was a peaceful, democratic Russia, a normal, boring European country in Russia. We failed, and we need to remember that. We have ответственность for that failure, as far as I'm concerned. I personally most certainly feel that. And when we were strategizing when I first joined the government in 2009, Boris used to say to me, he said it to Barack Obama, he said it many times. He said, Michael, your country has a lot of baggage here in Russia. And I worked in Russia for a while in the government. And he said, there's not much you guys can do here. Focus on Ukraine. He said, focus on Ukraine. Because if Ukraine has a strong, vibrant democracy, remember, this is before Putin invaded the first time. This is before 2014. He said, there's nothing more that will be good for the development of Russian democracy than a successful Ukrainian democracy. And I just had Viktor Yushchenko at my house last week in California, and he was talking about your father, and he said many things that Pavlo just said, that he was the last great Russian political figure who understood this relationship. And he understood it, and then I'm going to get to sanctions, I promise. But this is very important to me. I flew 8,000 miles to be here because he understood something about Putin that I want. The Russians understand this, but maybe not everybody understands this. In fact, I'm going to tell you an anecdote from a time when I understood it. I was sitting in the room with Putin, with Vice President Biden. This is about a decade ago. And you're going to be Biden, I'm going to be Putin, okay? And I'm not going to sit like Putin sits.
I'm not good at acting.
Yeah, I'm not going to do that. But we were talking about Georgia, and we were talking about various issues. And Putin always comes prepared for these meetings, right? And he leaned in to the vice president. He said, you know what your problem is, you people in the West, is you look at our skin. And he went just like this. You look at our skin. And because we look like you think that we think like you. But we don't. We're different. Мы иная. We're другая. He said that. Because he wanted Biden to believe that Russians are different. They're not part of it.
What did he respond?
It's like, he didn't respond in person, but afterwards he's like, wow, that was a lot of weird shit. We've had many kind of meetings with Mr. Putin on that. But the point I'm trying to make is, remember, Putin also says that Ukrainians are just Russians with accents, right? They're not real, they're no different. So a vibrant democracy in Ukraine is the first and necessary step for any future for democracy in Russia. And I feel, because I deal with a lot of Russians and I deal with Ukrainians every single day, and there's a disconnect between these communities, and I want to implore upon you to think about that. In fact, I think your foundation should have a special session one day to study the way your father talked about Ukraine. I think that would be really educational, especially for young Russians and for young Ukrainians who also don't believe. They have a view of Russians too these days. I'm not going to go into it, but they have a view of Russians today that they think they're all the same. They have the same mentality. I think that's a challenge that we should take on. All right, you asked about sanctions. Why aren't they not working, or what should be done? What was your question? I forgot.
Well, I would have also forgotten after your speech and everything. But the question was, what are the key challenges that make sanctions less effective that many expected them to be?
So let me say two broad things, and I promise I won't say anything more. We have a big panel. So the first thing I want to say, especially sitting in Germany, in Berlin, is I applaud what the West did to impose the sanctions that they did. This was not inevitable. Didn't happen in 2014. Didn't happen in 2008 for those that want to politicize it in my country. You know how many Russians were sanctioned after Russia invaded Georgia? 0. So it was not inevitable that what happened, happened. And I think we should acknowledge the fact, especially Europe, especially Germany, did some very important things. We wanted to do these things back in 2009. We wanted to reduce Russian exports of hydrocarbons to this part of the world. It finally got done. That's a great achievement. Russia has less money today to build weapons to kill Ukrainians than they would have had there been no sanctions. That's an achievement. Russia struggles to acquire the technology it needs to build the rockets it builds to kill Ukrainians. That's an achievement of sanctions. And it is much harder to transact with Russian companies because of financial sanctions than it was on February 23rd, 2024. So we need to acknowledge what is done. That was good, but you didn't ask that question. You asked what were the flaws. And I could go into in detail. Let me just say some broad things. One, like our military assistance, and now I want to speak as an American, not as, I'm just speaking about American policy towards sanctions. That's what I know the best. But like with our policy towards military assistance, we've had an incremental approach to sanctions, when I think we should have had a big bang approach to sanctions. All in, all at once, rather than ratcheting up. And I think we've paid the price to that, because ratcheting up has allowed the Russians to figure out loopholes, and they've done that. Second, we have wanted to have sanctions that impose zero costs on Americans. And by the way, a lot of Russians have wanted to have sanctions that impose zero costs on Russian society. I study sanctions. I know the history of sanctions. It doesn't work that way, folks. You have to accept certain costs in order for them to achieve success. And I think that mentality has been wrong. And then the third thing I would say about our sanctions strategy, and I'm happy to go in, I have 14 things that should be done. Что делать? There's lots to be done. But the third piece is there's a action-reaction cycle in our sanctions community, which is we do sanctions and then we stop, and then Russia does something horrible, and so we do something new. That's not the right mentality. Sanctions should be increasing every day, squeezing and squeezing and squeezing every day. Think about it. I don't know what parking tickets are like here in Berlin, but where I live at Stanford University, if you park your car in the wrong place, you get a ticket that day. And it's a lot, by the way, $80. If you keep your car there the second day, you get another ticket. You don't just pay the price of the first ticket. And if you keep your car there for a third day, you get another ticket. That's the mentality we need to have with sanctions. Every day, the Russian barbaric army is parked in Ukraine. There needs to be a new round of sanctions. That's the mentality, but we don't have that mentality. We have a kind of sufficient response, in part because we don't want to incur costs ourselves.
Thanks, Michael. I would like to also ask all panelists to be concise in their remarks.
I was not concise, and I won't speak again.
No. I didn't interrupt you because you flew all the way to Berlin, and I appreciate it a lot. So, Alexander, should I repeat the question, or you still remember this?
It works good. No, I still remember the question. Thanks for that. My answer would be less broad and less political, since I'm not a politician. I'm on the expert field, and what I say that, speaking about unsuccess of sanctions on a very operational way, there were underestimated the effects of capital outflow, and from here I see rooms for improving sanctions, but the decision is here on the political side. Paradoxically, sanctions, so Russia is now on its autarkic path of its economy, but paradoxically sanctions make Russian economy much more dependent on external factors than it was before. And so they, with one side, they're strengthening the Russian economy, protecting this from spillover effects from the global economy. But at the same time, they're weakening the economy, making it more fragile and vulnerable to any kind of external pressure. The most obvious channel of transmission shocks is oil prices, and if oil prices will go down for a while, not for a week, but for a term from 3 to 6 months, Russian budget will suffer. Sanctions already limited Putin's ability to get external resources. We see that they are not growing. They're not shrinking yet. Putin is not running out of money, and here's the bad news here for 2025 at least. At the very minimum for 2025, he has money, and actually what just recently Putin done, he shows the world and his country that he can increase taxes, so put much more burden on people and corporate, and then put all the money from the taxes to the war effort, and shows that he can do it. But also, thanks to sanctions, it is a one-off. So I'm not sure that economy could bear next tax hike, and well, there is no signs that they're planning they're planning this. Russian economy became much more dependent on imports, and this process of so-called import substitution become extremely important for some Russian enterprises. Otherwise, they couldn't function. They couldn't function fully. We see that how sanctions limiting Russian ability to make import substitution, and to increase output in some certain industries. So basically, we don't see how a military industry complex operates on its full capacity, but under other industries are not growing, and oil industry, the milking cow for Russian budget, is actually decreasing its output. So sanctions significantly increasing costs of Russian economy, and the major indicator of this is inflation. And despite double-digit key rate, we don't see inflation quickly going down, and it is also because of external limitation put in Russian economy by sanctions. But here I'm quite skeptical, since I see that Russian society and Russian elites are yet consider the costs as bearable. So that's why they tolerate the current stance of affairs. I will stop here with sanctions. I can talk hours about that, but I'm happy to meet all your questions. Thank you.
Dr. Pake, what's your take on sanctions? What are the key challenges you see that prevent them from being more effective than they thought to be?
Let me first also make a personal remark. As president of the Friedrich Naumann Foundation, Zhanna, we are very proud to work with the Boris Nemtsov Foundation. And we are proud for the reasons that Michael has given before. I had not the privilege of meeting personally Boris Nemtsov, but I saw a lot of pictures. I saw a lot of videos. And he was a really great, charismatic man. A representative of Russian, which we would love to see today. And Zhanna, please keep on the torch. We will support you.
Thank you.
Now, let me say a few very general words, political and economic. I'm an economist by training, about the sanctions. Let me first say something very fundamental. When the sanctions were introduced, I heard a lot of so-called experts saying that this would bring Russia to its knees, the Russian economy. I thought this forecast was absolutely stupid from the beginning. I was deeply convinced that a resource-rich country like Russia, with a population that was ready to take some sacrifices if necessary, would live with the sanctions. And that, of course, Russia would find ways of circumventing, to some extent, the sanctions, which is absolutely normal in the situation. And at the time, I was also interviewed, and I said, okay, there will be a blip in growth for a while, maybe, but then the economy will recover. There will be wounds in terms of a little bit higher inflation, a little bit more distortions in the foreign trade, and I could go on with a lot of minor allocative deficiencies that were the consequence. But this will not bring Russia to its knees, just like, let me say this, in the Second World War, the Nazis, a much smaller country, than Russia, with much less resources, was brought to its knees due to the isolation, but to the tough fight of the Allies against Hitler. Now, that said, I think that the expectations were wrong, and the results are not at all surprising. That said, let me make a political point. I think that really there has been a sea change politically within the West. And I'm very happy to sit next to Janis Kluge. And I tell you a little true anecdote, which took place on February the 22nd, 2021 on Zoom. At that time, there was a hearing of the committee, the economic committee of the German Bundestag, with so-called specialists, and we were invited as specialists, where he is a real one, I'm not, but there were other specialists nominated from other parties. You were nominated by the Greens, I was nominated by the Liberals. And I tell you, 1 year, exactly 1 year before the war broke out, the vast majority of so-called experts in this round were against the sanctions. They basically said, well, this brings nothing, so let's get rid of them. These were the sanctions, the post-Crimean sanctions, okay? So a much more lighter dose. Now, we defended the sanctions because we said, and I said this even as an economist, well, sanctions are a major political signal to the world. And we are obliged to make this signal, and this signal will have deep effects, but the effects will not be visible as easily as you may see economic effects. But those are limited, I said already. So I think this signal has been made. The West has stood together surprisingly well, and especially this country, Germany, okay? We had an energy policy over 20 years which was completely reversed. And we went through something of a difficult time, but people were ready to do it, and it was less difficult than many so-called experts predicted at the time. And we more or less have gone over that by now. So the people were ready for the adjustment, were ready to take the cost, and this is how the West, by and large, stood together. You know, I could talk about the geopolitics, you know. Putin, with his invasion, brought the Swedes into NATO and Finland into NATO. In the Swedish case, it's after 200 years of neutrality. That's an enormous miscalculation of Putin. So in a sense, the West was strengthened. And finally, of course, the signal is a geopolitical signal which goes well above Europe. China may think twice about Taiwan in the future. And I think this has very deep and fundamental geopolitical consequences which we may go into. So the bottom line is sanctions have worked, although clearly imperfectly. They will never bring the Russian economy to its knees, but they will have an effect. And the real significance of the sanctions is geopolitical.
Dmitry.
Sorry, I'm going to switch to Russian because I want to be a little bit more precise on this subject because it's a really sensitive subject for us. Я бы хотел, я из Беларуси, и я бы хотел поговорить немного о подходе к санкциям в отношении именно Беларуси, или скорее о двух подходах к Беларуси, потому что первый подход к Беларуси как к инструменту российской агрессии против Украины и, возможно, дальнейшей агрессии против Европы, он всем сейчас очевиден, и в разгар войны, разумеется, абсолютно оправданы максимальные санкции, которые снижают потенциал помощи белорусских госпредприятий, прежде всего, российскому ВПК, немалое количество военного заказа российского в данный момент исполняется в Беларуси. И этот подход, в общем-то, принят, используется и имеет на данный момент адекватный характер, за исключением несинхронизированных санкций. Например, не знаю, более 2 лет ушло у Европы на осознание того факта, что бан продажи люксовых автомобилей в Россию абсолютно не работает до тех пор, пока в отношении Беларуси не введены аналогичные санкции. И только летом этого года была закрыта продажа дорогих автомобилей через Беларусь, потому что это не создавало никаких ограничений для России, просто Лукашенко и его окружение зарабатывали дополнительные деньги на перепродаже этих же автомобилей в Россию. И вот эти несовершенства и несинхронизация в экономическом отношении постепенно устраняются. Мне кажется, здесь все, пусть с опозданием, но происходит, и эти санкции близки к тому, чтобы иметь уже какой-то свой разумный потенциал, который вообще достижим на данном этапе. Но есть и второй подход к Беларуси. Я бы хотел, чтобы он не уходил из поля зрения людей, которые в принципе интересуются и имеют возможность принимать решения по этой теме. Это подход к Беларуси как к одной из первых жертв российской империалистической политики. И жертвы не безнадежные, жертвы, которые все еще сопротивляются. И у белорусского гражданского общества по-прежнему, несмотря на то, что оно в значительной степени сейчас находится в перекрестном обстреле и белорусской, и российской пропаганды, и заблокированы все независимые медиа, одно из которых я представляю, и создаются, полностью уничтожены все институты гражданского общества. Несмотря на это, разница в восприятии российской войны против Украины между русскими и белорусами сохраняется. Она сохраняется в том числе даже той частью белорусского населения, которая продолжает поддерживать Лукашенко. И не случайно, вот сейчас Лукашенко собирается идти на основные перевыборы. Он, будучи абсолютным исполнителем воли Путина, будучи транслятором его угроз в отношении Запада, не знаю, ядерной угрозы и каких-то иных, он при этом внутри Беларуси пытается реализовывать мирный дивиденд, извлекать мирный дивиденд, идя на эти выборы, представляя себя гарантом мира, что вот кругом война, а мы те самые люди, которые, точнее, да, кто сохраняет в Беларуси мир. И сочетание первого подхода с максимальным, ударом по экономическому потенциалу, по потенциалу экономического соучастия в российской войне против Украины и в то же время поддержки белорусского гражданского общества и взгляда на белорусов как на первую, в общем-то, по сути, первый захваченный в постсоветское время народ, мне кажется, является очень важным, потому что с точки зрения послевоенного урегулирования возможные изменения в Беларуси или, по крайней мере, не полное торжество тоталитаризма внутри страны усиливает, безусловно, безопасность Украины, Польши, Литвы и, в принципе, Европы в этом регионе. Приведу один простой пример. Даже белорусские военные, будучи, в общем-то, довольно покорными исполнителями роли Лукашенко, точнее, приказов Лукашенко, белорусские военные участвовали в подавлении протестов в Беларуси в 2020 году, сейчас видят бенефит того, что они не русские. Потенциал превращения белорусской армии в российскую, и Беларусь в часть России сохраняется. Они видят этот бенефит и сознают его. Они не участвуют в войне, они просто живы в данный момент. И отдельный канал воздействия с белорусским обществом и должен сохраняться. Если переводить на язык санкций, мне нравится в этом смысле подход офиса Светланы Тихановской «Sanction goods, not people». Совершенно очевидно, что виза-бан или какие-то иные санкции в отношении белорусов в Европе носят спорный характер, и не очевидно, что они приносят пользу для решения задач, которые стоят вообще в нашем регионе.
Янис?
Thank you very much. And first, I find it interesting that we speak about sanctions today because to me, it seems to be a topic that is not so much on the agenda at the moment. After there has been some disappointment over the last, let's say, 2 years, because some of the initial expectations didn't come true. The second thing is that Russia is often called the most sanctioned country in the world, and if you look at the individual number of measures, this may be true, but there are much stricter sanctioned countries than Russia. For example, sanctions on Iran are stricter than sanctions on Russia, and sanctions on North Korea as well. So we have some pretty big deliberate loopholes in these sanctions, and Russian oil exports are still flowing at the same rate like before the war. Russian banks are still dealing with dollars and euros, still members in SWIFT, not all of them, but there are some. And the only thing that really dramatically changed is Russian gas export, but that was not a sanction result, but the decision of Vladimir Putin. So what this tells you is that there are limits to sanctions that can be imposed at the moment. And I think that these limits fundamentally caused by our own weakness of our own maybe political systems. We have many, whenever we discuss individual measures, what else could be done, there are many things that are on the table, many things that you could tweak or, where you could add pressure, but mostly you run into the barrier that there's some risk involved for the sanctioning country. And there's simply no willingness at the moment, Ambassador McFaul pointed to this, to bear any costs or take on any risk to extend the effectiveness of sanctions. And so I think this is actually our own weakness, which is reflected in the fact that we don't sanction more at the moment, that we allow Russia to operate as it is operating right now. So, and I also want to say that sanctions have not been meaningless and they have had a great effect, but because of these limits, we are dependent on external factors to help us. When the oil price is high, Russia will be able to compensate what we do. So we are dependent on the oil price falling, but we don't have it under our control. And so now we are sitting there and we're waiting for the oil price to fall. If that does happen, then, as Alexander said, Russia is vulnerable because we froze the reserves, most of it, and there will be some serious problems, and some of the sanctions effects will show only then. But we have, to have the help of external factors like the oil price. We have to count on Russia making mistakes, and they don't. So, the management of the sanctions has been pretty smart. There's, I think, at least, Russia is still trying to keep sort of a market economy going as much as possible. And, in this scenario, there are simply limits of what can be achieved unless we change our own, price that we are willing to pay for this.
So I'm a bit surprised not to have heard one problem, which is enforcement. I actually spoke with a couple of journalists, and I think Mikhail Maglov is here right now. I don't see him. No, he's not. He is here, yeah. Yeah, and Michael Maglov, actually, he works for Project Media High. He doesn't speak English, that's why he has to use his headphones. So he covers sanctions, and he keeps on saying that the key challenge, the key problem is enforcement, especially in Europe. So in the US agencies go after companies that try to circumvent the sanctions regime. Whereas here in Europe, enforcement, so companies are do not feel that they will be punished, and that's why they take a very formal approach to sanctions. And in many cases, they basically trade with countries like Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, and Kyrgyzstan, and through these countries, necessary parts or products go to Russia. So I know that no one here is an expert on enforcement, but I want to hear your some basic thoughts if it is a real challenge and European governments should address it. Yeah, go ahead.
So just for evidence-wise, I want to show Zhanna, if you can read my handwriting, I wrote my 15 points. Enforcement is the very first word about what is to be done. So I'm glad you asked that question, because there are many other things, and I just want to echo, foot stomp what's been said. These are political decisions. In my country, there's a debate that says, well, we've sanctioned everybody and everything, there's nothing more we can do. That is not true. And if we get into the future, maybe I'll go through other things that can be done. But first and foremost, enforce what is already there without question, especially when it comes to the export through tankers out of Russia of hydrocarbons. We had a price cap in place. It was announced with great fanfare at $60 a barrel, and we have not taken the measures, if we had the political will, to make that more effective. So without question, that's number one. And without question, it's literally sanctioning all the tankers, making it that they cannot acquire financing and insurance, and then those countries that have borders with waters that they pass through saying, no, tankers in this black, this black fleet, if you don't have insurance, you cannot come by our borders because it's a risk to our borders. That, to me, just enforcing that piece would be a huge achievement. Second, you mentioned all this, the countries, Uzbekistan, China, Georgia, Belarus, where technology flows. And I want to be clear about this. My government rightly focuses on what the Chinese are doing to underwrite the Russian military-industrial complex. They're doing a lot, and we should try to stop that. But we should first try to stop our technology and European technology from going through these third parties. Now, it's difficult. It's a technically difficult thing to do. I've talked to these companies, and they say, Mike, once we sell our product, we can't tell where the chips in the refrigerator will go. That's a difficult problem. But I actually think it is a problem that we could do a lot more about, especially if we threaten to sanction our own companies that participate in this. So secondary sanctions has to be, and we're tiptoeing towards that. We have to do more through the intermediaries. But I think we have to put on notice our own companies that are participating in this. It is a sin, in my view. A company like Schlumberger is still helping Russia to get its oil and gas out of the ground. How can that be true, folks, 3 years into this war? There are hundreds of American companies still working inside Russia. So we should start, enforcement is everything, and we should start first and foremost with discouraging our own companies from underwriting Putin's war in Ukraine.
Anyone else would like to comment on enforcement?
I just want to add, because yes, enforcement is the most important part of any kind of sanctions policy. But sanctions-wise, I think we're at the point where there is no silver bullet for Russian economy. If you come to me and with a question which I often been addressed, that what can else we do to put Russian economy on the knees, I said, no, actually nothing. There is no one thing you can forbid for Putin, and he says, okay, I will stop the war. No, it's not going to happen, unfortunately. And all tough measures are already in place, and because of the incremental approach, Russia had time to adjust. And there is also very important to keep in mind that Russia, we're in two different mindsets. The West, which approach to sanctions as something which limits Russia's development, and the West with its long-term perspective, because West is limited, has political limitations, institutional limitations, and all other sort of limitations which Putin hasn't. And Putin's Russia, where the Kremlin, government, and businesses on daily basis survive, so their day starts from the idea, so okay, what today I need to do to bypass limitations put on transactions, to bypass limitations put on smuggling stuff I need to sell to the government, to develop a military industrial complex and other stuff. And being in survival mode and being in normal mode, it's two different, completely different modus operandi, and which are underestimated. And one more thing about sanctions, it's good to be, strategy of overhauling tankers, it's quite good, but it requires time. And so, does the West has its time? I don't know. That's the question for the Westerners. I mean, tankers and insurance, it's very important. But I also think that we're at the point where policymakers can be creative and stimulate a capital outflow and brain drain from Russia. The current sanctions design is they are locking up brains and capital within Russia, and this capital fulfill Putin's war machine. We see how high net Russians return their capital into Russia by Putin's favor, and proving his point of view, what he said now. So basically, now he's dancing "I told you so" dance, saying that, and this money looking for how to harbor within Russian economy, because Western financial system told we don't want this money here. I know and I truly believe that there are possibilities within current financial tools to segregate a safe space for Russian money to stimulate outflow, capital outflow from Russia. And it will hurt both Putin's economy and Putin's ego, since he's very sensitive to this stuff. Same with the brain drain. We see how narrowing the room for Russians to exit the country and massive migration. Well, Kremlin can say that that it doesn't bother this, but it bothers, and they are forcing people to give up their passports. They're limiting people's ability to travel abroad because they want to keep these brains within the country. And some people return, some immigrants, a lot of them return to Russia because they were not welcome here. Not in saying but welcome, I'm not meaning red carpet, but I mean the basic needs of people to get bank accounts and possible residency permit. So I think if the West will switch policy from no Russians to Russians who are not involved in activity with Kremlin, they are welcome to come here, to set their business there, to work for the best for the Western economy and for the worst for the Putin economy. That is also painful for Putin's economy and for Putin's ego. Thanks.
Dr. Pagia, do you want to comment on enforcement? No. Oh yeah, please.
Well, on enforcement, it's a bit, it's not totally clear what is meant by it, because you can speak about enforcement inside your jurisdiction. So let's say what's going on in Germany. And this is essentially a question of capacities, of intelligence, of knowing what's going on, identifying those who are breaking laws and punishing them. But enforcing in a different jurisdiction, let's say, enforcing, that certain oil is not sold above the oil price cap to an Indian company, that's a different matter, and we have to use different tools. We cannot go there with our police. So what we have to do is to scare, essentially, other actors into compliance. So we have to threaten them, as you said, with secondary sanctions. And the problem here is that it's something that we're seeing right now, actually, with the ships you spoke of. Some of these blacklisted ships are actually moving again. And this is always the problem that, this scare, it's not quite clear what exactly is going to happen if people are not compliant with sanctions in a different jurisdiction. They might be afraid, but, if nothing happens, they will try something small. If nothing happens, they try a bit more. And over time, this erodes. So you have to maintain the credibility. And I think this is one of the reasons why OFAC is at the moment a bit careful with blacklisting more tankers, which they could do. They are afraid that if they do that, then later on they will have to punish the companies that then try to do deals with them. And you sort of you get into this endless chain of punishment that you have to follow up on these threats. Otherwise, you will lose your credibility. And this is a bit, I think, the risk right now that the U.S. sanctioning power, which is mainly based on its threat to do secondary sanctions, it is a bit diminishing because it's not quite clear how far the US is really willing to go if certain companies in India or China are not compliant. So this I think is an important difference.
Well, the main point has been made.
It works.
It's on? Yeah, great. The main point I wanted to make has been already made by Yanis. I think it's very important to be clear that once you enter the wide field of enforcing secondary sanctions against countries like India. India is a good example. A country which will never join clearly and explicitly I call it the anti-Russian front now. They won't. They take a middle stand, like Brazil, and there are quite a few very important countries. It's not just China. it's not just Georgia, where, as we found out in a study of our partners, there is a lot going on in terms of smuggling, if you like, and relabeling and whatever. It really becomes a major political question of the relationship to these third countries, if you like. And that, of course, whether we like it or not, will constrain the decisions of European countries and even of the Americans. Let me add one point which is may have got lost before, also in my own first statement on sanctions. When I say that a country can live with the sanctions, it will not be brought to its knees economically, it does not mean that there is no price. You know, also the permanent search for new ways of circumventing the sanctions, they do it quite intelligently in Russia, but it, of course, hangs up your whole economic system into a kind of ever-increasing autarkic disequilibrium, if you like. And the price, you know, it's a cumulative process where year by year, if the sanctions are kept up and really enforced to the extent that is possible, adds up to a loss of potential dynamics of the economy. And I think this is exactly the path Russia is in at the moment. It will not be brought to its knees, but it will lose a lot of its, in the medium and long run, it will lose a lot of its growth potential, which is, of course, highly important for its fulfilling its geopolitical role. So, in a way, sanctions are also a matter of patience. Let's keep them, let's go on, let's reinforce them wherever necessary, let's introduce maybe new ones if relevant and necessary. And so we will see the Russian economy sliding ever more into a very inefficient path, and by the way, losing a lot of young people, talented people who leave the country.
Thank you very much. I want to follow up on what Alexandra said about Russian people. So we know that Russians and Belarusians now facing a lot of problems in Europe, and it's apparently, if you have a Russian pass or a Belarusian pass, it's a red flag. And I want to agree with what Alexandra said, because I think we read the same report published on Bloomberg that 40% of those people who left Russia in 2022 returned in boost for Putin's economy. And Michael McFaul here rightly said about a lack of skilled labor, and so probably it was a policy mistake to let them go, because it obviously did not help Ukraine, but it has already helped Putin. I want to have your take on this, because you said in your first remarks, it was like mild, that Russian people should pay a price for waging a war against Ukraine. And then I will also ask Dmitry what's his take on this passport thing.
Ну, я бы сказал... Окей, да, я бы сказал, что вот эту проблему миграции из Беларуси и как бы частичного возвращения, которое мы видим в России, в Беларуси решена самим режимом Лукашенко в силу своих репрессивных особенностей. Он сделал невозможным это возвращение, и несколько десятков людей, которые, вернувшись, сели в тюрьму, просто послали сигнал остальным, что возвращаться нет никакого смысла, и нужно строить жизнь и развивать ее в наших новых странах. Что мы и пытаемся делать. Мы, продолжая работать для Беларуси как нон-профит, строим for-profit бизнес в Европе, и действительно это непросто. Является ли белорусский паспорт настолько же там red flag, как русский, я бы сказал, почти, 90%. И это, конечно, затрудняет. Есть проблема обычных людей с банковскими счетами, легализацией и так далее. Есть двойные, тройные проблемы у бизнесов. Я управляю бизнесом в Европе, имея белорусский паспорт. И это, конечно, создает фантастический cost of doing business, потому что бесконечные комплаенсы со стороны банков, непроходящие платежи, комплаенсы со стороны бигтеха. Любая новая инновация по нам бьет, может быть, первым, потому что мы действительно физически находимся здесь. И у меня была иллюзия когда-то, что вот когда началась война, что есть какой-то один этап, когда ты объяснишь, что ты не верблюд, а ты, наоборот, нормальный человек, который пытаешься, чтобы в нашем регионе была нормальная, не знаю, проевропейская, мирная Беларусь. Но, оказывается, нет, этот крест нам придется нести до конца всем. Я не один такой белорусский предприниматель, у нас много, и эти проблемы сходные. И я бы сказал, что текущая динамика создает повышенную мотивацию для всех, как можно скорее отказываться от белорусских паспортов, получать новые, быстрее локализоваться и забыть, может быть, Беларусь как страшный сон. Она не очень позитивна для будущего региона. В этой стране, в Беларуси, после того, как будет мир, после того, как когда-то Лукашенко умрет, когда-то что-то еще может произойти, там кто-то должен жить. И белорусы, которые уехали из Беларуси, желательно не должны терять connections с ними. То же самое касается, я, может быть, чуть-чуть кратко развил бы тему ограничений на путешествия, которые есть у белорусов. Более 300 тысяч белорусов живут в Польше. И это отличный инструмент для того, чтобы ломать вот эту польскую пропаганду. Если вот то, чем для России являются англосаксы, для белорусской пропаганды это Польша. У нас бесконечно рассказывают про то, что они, с одной стороны, нацисты, с другой стороны, там нищета, бедность, разруха и так далее. И нет лучшего способа эту пропаганду дезактивировать, когда, я не знаю, там родители уехавших людей из белорусских райцентров смогут приезжать к своим детям в Польшу и просто, не знаю, видеть тоже своими глазами, а не только по телефонному пересказу. И здесь есть место для более точной, более выверенной политики, будучи максимально жесткими и снижать экономический потенциал режима, в то же время оставлять окно для белорусского гражданского общества, не захлопывать его настежь, не бетонировать, и создавать возможность для какого-то позитивного дальнейшего динамики именно в нашем регионе Европы. Я уверен, что там вопрос безопасности Украины, который сейчас будет на повестке, наверное, многие годы вперед, в значительной степени решение этого вопроса могло бы быть усилено, не знаю, другой Белоруссией, более 1000 километров северной границы. Если бы Украина перестала чувствовать угрозу из этого региона, это бы просто даже при отсутствии смены в режима в России давало бы совершенно новую перспективу. Спасибо.
Michael?
So I'm going to answer this in an indirect way.
Why?
Сознательно. Because, and I'm going to start with an anecdote from my own life. And this is hard for me. I want to be careful about this. This is hard for me, especially in this auditorium right now, knowing that there are a lot of Russians here, right? How many people here are from Russia? Okay, how many people here are from Ukraine? Okay, that's what I thought. And that's why it's going to be hard for me. I'm going to tell you an anecdote, and then I'm going to make a challenge. But I'm going to answer your question, but I'm doing it in a roundabout way. The night that Russian soldiers escalated their invasion of Ukraine for a second time, February 24th, I was speaking to lots of my Ukrainian friends. And I have lots of Ukrainian friends. I interact with Ukrainians every single day. And one of them, I'll bet you a lot of people know her. Her name's Svetlana Zalashuk. Sveta was getting out of Kiev, stuck in traffic, didn't know what was going to happen. And, I said, I'm with you, in some bullshit solidarity statement. And she said, thanks, Michael, but I can't believe we have to fight this bastard alone. That was February 24th, 2024. And after that day, I made a pledge to myself that every day, not just once a week, not once a month, not sending a check to Nova Ukraina once a year, that every single day I was going to try to think about What can I do today to help stop this barbaric invasion of Ukraine? And every day, I feel inadequate. No. It's failure. Every day, I feel like I'm not doing enough. Every day, I feel like I have 20 things that we should be doing on sanctions. I'm going to read them really quick if you let me. If you don't, that's okay.
I don't.
But there's every day we can be doing more. And I want to start with that before I tackle the question of Russians and their passports and their bank accounts. Because there's such an asymmetry of suffering that Russians need to be sensitive to your Ukrainians who have the same objectives before we get into the question you just said. That's very, very important for me to say. Number two, what we need to do, and I won't go in detail, but here's what we need to do. Enforce the price cap with the ships. We already talked about that. Lower the price cap. That's number 2 to 30. 3, secondary sanctions. We already talked about that. And that's not just political with countries, by the way. I enforce secondary sanctions in Russia. I remember going to VTB at the 48th floor, being served caviar, to say, Mike, don't sanction us. And I said, no, we're going to sanction you. And I know Mr. Lavrov told you not to listen to us, and guess what? VTB changed because they were more interested in their economic interests, not what Mr. Lavrov was saying. We've got to do more of that. 4th, give the CBR assets to the Ukrainian people. This has been absurd how long this is going on. This is a giant mistake. You want to send a signal to Putin about the future? Give that money now. 5th, more categories of Russians need to be sanctioned. Yes, we've sanctioned a lot. There's 100,000 more that should be sanctioned. 5th, Rosatom and fertilizer companies. 6th, declare Russia a state sponsor of terrorism. In my country, Cuba is on that list, folks. Cuba. If Cuba's on that list, how in God's name do we not have the courage to put Russia on that list? 8th, I'm going on too long. Now I got to your point. 8th is your question. Better incentives for the outflow of money and people from Russia. This was a mistake. I think in retrospect, I wouldn't have said this 2 years ago. I had this conversation with senior Ukrainian officials, very, very senior Ukrainian officials. And their position was, we want to seize their money. We don't want them to give their money to the West. We want to seize their money of all the oligarchs. And having lived through sanctions before and having done it with the Iranians, I was skeptical that was going to work in the time that it wanted. I think in retrospect, that was a mistake. We want all smart people in Russia to come to the Silicon Valley. We want all money that we can. To your point, I agree completely. We want capital outflow from Russia. That is, I believe, another mechanism for speeding the end of this war. Look at what happened with Yandex, for instance. A great, great case. That should have been a no-brainer. That should have been done in the beginning. We don't want people developing artificial intelligence in Russia. We want them developing those companies, in the case of Yandex, here in Europe. You guys could use a lot more AI companies, by the way, here in Europe, and that we should have gotten those people out. But I didn't want to say that first, because it's 8th on my list. 9th is sanctions on oil and gas, those that facilitate oil and gas, the Schlumbergers. 10th is all subsidiaries of Rostec. 12th, more pressure for all Western companies to leave Russia. 13th, more pressure on financial sanctions. There are way too many loopholes. 14th, this is a challenge to you all. Russians, if you care about your country is becoming a colony of China. You need to make that message clear to people inside Russia. I don't think that's in your long-term national interest. And then 15th, Dmitry, to your point, a strategy that Belarus, we agree completely, our sanction group agrees completely. Belarus needs to be thought of as a piece of the sanctions, not as something separate. But there's 15 things we can do, not just one, but the one thing you mentioned should also be done.
Thank you, Michael. I now want to take... I now want to take some questions from the audience, if you have any. Misha, go. I will take one round, and then I think if we have time, the second round. Mish, go ahead, but you need a mic. You can get it from somewhere. Оль.
Спасибо большое. Михаил Моглов, журналист-расследователь. Если можно, очень короткую сначала ремарку, а потом конкретный вопрос. Я очень благодарен за эмоциональное выступление. И как человек из России, в том числе, который выходил на площади с Борисом Немцовым, мы работая, хотел бы напомнить, что когда мы боролись с этим ублюдком, мы были одни в то время, когда и США, и Европейский Союз делали бизнес. Мы были одни. Но вопрос мой следующий. Говоря про санкции, важно помнить, тут упоминалось, что как раз благодаря Борису Немцову, который принудил вспомнить санкции как инструмент на примере акта Магнитского, и это была хорошая работа на будущее. В 2014 году были введены санкции масштабные и Соединенными Штатами, и Европейским Союзом. Но с точки зрения применения этих санкций с 2014 года по 2022 год не было возбуждено ни одного уголовного расследования за нарушение санкций, когда мы сообщали о сотнях и тысячах этих нарушений. В это время Соединенные Штаты получали удобрения от компании Аркадия Ротенберга, и не было никакого расследования. В это время немецкие технологические холдинги при поддержке немецкого правительства открывали в России завод, который собирал станки для военных заводов, и не было никакого расследования. Продолжая разговор о применении санкций, у меня вот и к Майклу, и Янису, и Карлу два вопроса. Первый. Поддерживаете ли вы политически криминальные расследования в отношении своих граждан и своих компаний, которые нарушали и нарушают санкции? А второй вопрос. Как вы считаете, почему даже сейчас мы не видим этих криминальных расследований? У США чуть больше, но недостаточно. В Европе криминальных расследований о нарушении санкций, об обходе санкций, ну, если не единицы, то десятки, хотя зафиксированных фактов намного и намного больше. Спасибо.
Иван?
Yes, I'm Ivan Fomin. I'm with NEMTSOV Foundation, and my question is about the effect of sanctions on the Russian elite. And I think it's a question to Michael and to Alexandra. So we didn't see many defections in the Russian elite after the full-scale invasion started and the sanctions were imposed. Do you see any flaws in how the sanctions are designed and implemented that prevent them from being effective in this respect?
Последний вопрос.
My name is Alex Sprinz, and I'm a journalist with CBC, Canadian Public Television. It's a question for Michael. It's kind of connected to sanctions. One of the things that's very obvious in watching the last 2.5 years is the West has been deterred by Putin's unpredictability and the nuclear threat and nuclear saber rattling. What is there? In a sense, the West is sanctioning Ukraine to some degree in terms of what it can do because of that. So I'm wondering what you think we should be doing and how we should be handling this whole situation of the nuclear threat and Putin's saber rattling.
I would like to start with Yanis and to answer the question of Mikhail. Did you understand his question about criminal investigations into sanctions circumvention in Europe?
Right. If I may, just a brief follow-up on the discussion about Russian people and Russian money. I know it's a very touchy topic. It's a very important topic. I just want to maybe tell you why it is from the, let's say, from the German side or from the Western side. Sometimes it's difficult, and you know in some way sometimes Western countries make it too easy for themselves, and they just blanket ban all Russian visas and so on. This is wrong. But you also know that if we have an opening for Russian money to flow out or for Russian people to come, this will be exploited. This will be exploited for bringing money out that should not come out. That we have unfortunately had experiences not maybe from Russians that left the country in the last 2 years, but we had the Morozov case that you know about. And this simply makes it difficult to, you know yourself that, I have a lot of respect for, the Russians who resisted Putin, the Russians who are out and doing investigation like Mikhail. I have lots of respect, sorry. But the people here usually are not competent enough, don't know enough about the country to differentiate between, let's say, the good Russian and the bad Russian. This is a huge problem, but it doesn't mean that the bad Russian doesn't exist, and that, if we have an opening for people to come, that in the end this might be some kids of Kremlin elites who are coming, or some money might come out of Russia that then ends up financing some sanctions evasion. So this is why from our side I think that what Russian bad actors do poisons our response and makes that, I think, puts us into a position where we act unethical and we say we just block out all the Russians, which is wrong. So I just wanted to say it's sometimes a bit complicated, and knowing how much analysis there is done in, when it's about, for example, granting visas to Russians, how many things have to be certain and have to be known about this person before this is done. It's just it's complicated and it's difficult, and I understand the frustration, but it's just that this comes from how this is exploited sometimes by bad actors. Regarding criminal investigations against circumvention in Germany is absolutely necessary. The problem is that before 2022, I think there was not enough emphasis on it, and there was maybe that enforcement in the EU is based on the member state level, so German authorities have to investigate German companies, and be it the case of Siemens and its gas turbines on Crimea and so on. So I think this doesn't help. I think that after 2022 we have a bigger urgency, but we don't have the capacity, and this is a huge problem. That there are cases brought up, but this is also, the US is much more experienced in enforcing sanctions than the EU, and we are sometimes new in this, and still after 2.5 years don't have the enough capacities to really follow up on all these leads. We have a lot of information from Russian trade data and so on. We know a lot of things that are going on, but I think it's a question of capacity at the moment with the enforcement in Germany primarily. But I think it's happening. I also think that it's not the biggest problem for invasion. I think the biggest problem is evasion somewhere else. But I absolutely agree that it's crucial that we do this.
Dr. Paquet, the same question. You don't want to? All right. So then I'll turn to Mike. So also about criminal investigations, about how sanctions are perceived in the elites, etc.
So briefly on investigations, I think Giannis is right. This is an important question. There's not a lot of capacity. My sense in the U.S. government is that this is getting more attention. I know individuals who are personally responsible for this and see this as part of a larger strategy for discouraging bad behavior, and I think that was not true just 2 years ago. I don't want to say more about that because they don't like their investigations to be revealed until they're done, but I see more activity in that front coming. On elites, this is a very сложный вопрос. I know a lot of these people personally, and obviously some have used to live in London and now live in Moscow. They've made those choices. I think they're the wrong choices. I think in retrospect, I'll be honest, I had an idea at the beginning. My idea that nobody supported, I want to be clear about this. Not the Ukrainians, not the American government, and not the Russians. But my idea, as a way to incentivize to make this a win-win, is yes, Russian elites should be allowed to leave and to bring as much money as they can. Of course, Putin would make that very difficult for them, but to bring as much money as they can. But most of that money, and at least 50% of that money, would have to go to Ukrainian Reconstruction Fund. So you don't get to have all your money out. You have to actually, this is part of the penance you pay as a way to get out. And you have to say, you have to denounce Putin's war. And I had this discussion with many billionaires with money tied in Russia. And they didn't want to do that. It was too high of a price to pay. I had this conversation with people in Kiev. They said, no, they're all svolichi, they're all bastards, they're all supporting Putin. We're not going to give them a get-out-of-jail-free card. And I had this conversation with people in the White House and the State Department, and they said, Mike, this will look corrupt. And Giannis's point too. Bad people might get through in that process as well. And I take that's a history lesson, but I do think it would have been a better strategy than the one we're in now. But I wouldn't give up on it. I think that we want smart people to leave Russia. We want money to flow out of that economy. I think Germany, quite frankly, has done better at devising a system like this compared to my country. And we want people that are in opposition to Putin. I know lots of these people. You might not be surprised. We want them to open bank accounts in the United States and be able to conduct their business against Putin, using our facilities. And we have not created that infrastructure, and I think we should. And on the nuclear threat, I would just say two things. One, I was involved in all of these debates with our government. I worked with the president and his entire team before. I know these people well. I've had the chance, they at least give me the shot to talk to them, including the president from time to time. And I know that when you're sitting in the National Security Council and the CIA comes in and says, our new assessment, and this happened in the fall of 2022, our new assessment is that there's a 50% probability that Putin will use a nuclear weapon. Remember, that's when their armies were losing. And that was, we now know, that was the CIA's assessment. I know that you do not want to be the President of the United States that might be blamed for poking the bear. That's what one of our presidential candidates is saying right now. He's saying this war is our fault because we provoked Russia. If that would be happening, you do not want to be that. You want to do everything you can to minimize the probability of the use of a nuclear weapon. I understand that. That said, I think Putin has been very successful at deterring us from doing things that I think would have accelerated the completion, the end of this war. And that's just my personal view. And by the way, I want to be very clear about sanctions, because there's a difference sometimes about what sanctions are about. Sometimes sanctions are about convincing a leader to change his position. That's what we did with our sanctions vis-a-vis Iran. That is not my view about what sanctions are vis-a-vis Russia. I don't think Putin will ever change his mind. My view of sanctions is we want to reduce the money and technology that Russian soldiers and the military-industrial complex have so that they will be stopped on the battlefield. That's a difference of opinion about what they are. And we could have done that more effectively had we leaned in earlier and not been afraid of this escalatory threat. But I understand I don't have access to the classified material that President Biden was making those decisions, but I would have made a different decision.
Thank you. We are running out of time, but I would like to give the last word to Alexandra to comment on how sanctions are perceived by the Russian elites.
Thanks. But first, I wanted to make a follow-up on a more broader way. So, speaking about sanctions, well, in Russia, we like to say, "Вам шашечки или ехать?" Do you need a taxi or you need a ride? And policymakers should be pragmatic on what kind of approach they're using towards sanctions. So if you want to stop Putin killing Ukrainians on the battlefield, that's one approach. If you want to weaken Russian economy in the future, and it's another approach, and you need to have an image of Russian economy in the future to adjust your toolkit to this goal. If you want to overthrow a regime in Russia, that's third approach, basically, I'm not sure that it requires sanctions. Speaking about Russian elites, there was a perception that when that money of Russian oligarchs would be seized and Russian oligarchs would be under sanctions, they will go and overthrow their leader. That's how. And I want to, that's not going to happen. And basically, the rally around the flag effect happened more likely, but not on ideological basis, but more on pragmatic basis. Since Russia, big bunch of Russian oligarchs and Putin inner circle were sanctioned, but unequivocally without any kind of alternative. And if that alternative would provide it, I think the situation would be different. And one would think about Russian elites, why, if we go back to 2008, to the time of great financial crisis, there was a big bailout program from Russian government. They literally bail out Russian debt of Russian oligarchs, which were on European and US financial institutions. And I think that's the very important point when Putin showed its elites that he can control them financially and he will save them financially, both from the threat of the West, from political and from economical one. And that was also a point why they united around the Putin. I spoke with many of them multiple times. No one likes the situation. No one says, okay, let's go and kill more Ukrainians. Okay, let's continue this bloody war. No one likes this. But since their costs are still bearable, and they don't want to be accountable for this. They put all responsibility on this war on Putin, and they don't want to share that with them. And here's the problem with the Russian elites. So now Putin's offer to them not to be accountable to the bloody war in Ukraine and continue, well, not to thrive, but to get money back from sanctions, strengthening ties with China and so on. It's a better offer than an offer from the West. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, I have to close this panel because we're running out of time. I don't know, Olga, when we should reconvene here. And thank you for all the panelists for your insights. It was a great panel. Thank you very much.